So there he is, my encounter with Fidel Castro. Memorable, unforgettable to me at least.
I'm curious something, Geraldo, because you were talking about how he was considered certainly a significant figure in history. And there are some today that are saying, well, look at how well he did for his people when it comes to literacy. They had a very high literacy rate. People had access to like a government health care. And yet, they don't have access to the internet. They drive around in cars that were basically from 1956. You have to get permission from the government to move from one city to the next. So they have the ability to read, but actually not
still want to leave.
Do something with it. So I don't know what kind of a legacy that is.
Well, communism stinks, Dana. I mean, we all know that. I mean, the irony is these are the most beautiful beaches in the world, but the horizon that you see off the beaches is as far as most Cubans can get. Now with this loosening, now with President Obama's outreach to Cuba, now this powerhouse in Latin America, I think, can be harnessed. Now they'll get cell phones, they'll get satellite television. Communism cannot compete with capitalism. I think that the legacy of Castro will crumble. The ideological legacy will crumble. I think Cuba will become a real partner with the United States tourism. You know, their breakthroughs in medicine, their literacy that you mentioned. I think that in many ways, Cuba, an opening of Cuba, and I think that the relic of the Cold War has been so unfortunate. I think a lot of it, and you could talk about that all day long, is, you know, when the Cubans, when the middle class was disinvested, when their property was confiscated, and all the rich people and the rich corporations had all their property confiscated, that left a legacy of bitterness among the middle and upper classes in Cuba that impacted U.S. elections. I think it's fair to say that but for the Cuban Americans in South Florida in 2000, Al Gore would be president. And I think that Donald Trump in 2016 also benefited from the legacy of the bitterness that the Cuban exile community, particularly the older people in the Cuban exile community, have for Castro and communism and the confiscatory nature. But I think that looking at Castro's life, he took on the American Colossus. He took on all the West. He stood up I think that Cubans have a tremendous, even if the love-hate they had with Fidel, I think they have tremendous pride in the fact that they, that they are an independent country for all its flaws.
Well, you use the word legacy, and legacies are important. But if you look at the legacy of Fidel Castro, his people did want to leave their country. There was massive oppression and lockdowns of political dissidents and opponents. Middle class suffered greatly, set them back decades. So why the reflexive desire for some to see him as this cult hero and anything other than he was, which was a dictator who suppressed his people?
Well, you know, I think that, you know, God bless you, I think that that is an accurate summary, Pete, of the Castro on the dark side. But on the other side, if you were from the middle down in Cuban society, in the hierarchy, and you got free medicine that you didn't have under the dictator Batista, if you got some, if you could start a little business, if you could get access to higher education that you couldn't get unless you were an elite under Batista, the dictator that preceded communism and Castro and led to the revolution, you know, you think of Castro in a whole different way. And I think that in fairness, when you look at him and you talk about him, and I heard Governor Huckabee and slamming him, and he's a creep and a dictator and a repressive monster and all the rest. But if you ask the man in the street in Havana today, sure, they want to be in Miami or New York, and they want to have cell phones and so forth.
Because they don't have free speech. The man in the street couldn't talk because they'd be jailed if they were an opponent.
Well, I've been to Cuba several times, you know, particularly back in those days when they were really shut off. I think that it's very easy to have a simplistic view that he was all awful for Cuba and the world, and I just don't think that's accurate. I think that the Cubans have a tremendous sense of pride over his legacy, and I think that he will be remembered fondly. Yes, he was a leftist. Yes, he was a communist. Yes, his economic system failed. But the fact of the matter is, I mean, the Cuban medicine is renowned the world over. You know, there are aspects of what he left behind that I think will be remembered.
We're going to have to break this up. Back to your neutral corners. We're going to have to break this up.